With me is Dr. Todd Mikuriya, who has been associated with the medical marijuana movement for a long time. Can you kind of tell us a little bit of the story, how you got involved, because I think it's fascinating.
Once upon a time, I was struck by an inappropriate attack of curiosity when I was a sophomore in medical school. I came across an unassigned chapter in the pharmacology textbook Goodman and Gilman, a standard reference, and was fascinated by a 9-page chapter about cannabis, and learned that it had significant medical usage before, for some reason, it was taken away in about 1940. And that peak of curiosity launched me on a career. And this was back in 1959.
And you've been on that path ever since?
Yes, I have. I insinuated my way into the National Institute of Mental Health, where I was put in charge of the first overground cannabis research program in 1967. And at that time discovered that there was a concurrent secret study going on run by the Army and the military intelligence at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland.
What was this secret study?
Studying the congeners of cannabis for possible incapacitation purposes, but then later they discovered as a side effect that it was very effective in the treatment of epilepsy, and helped the director of this program get it declassified. But then this information was unfortunately deep-sixed, and to this day it's really not known in mainstream medicine.
Now, you work for NIDA, you said?
No, the precursor, the National Institute of Mental Health, Center for Narcotics and Drug Addiction Studies.
And were you involved in medical marijuana research at that time, or what was it?
I could only do it from a bibliographic perspective, and laid out the proposed funding for the research, which never got done, because they were more interested in the possible political significance of cannabis as connected with anti-war protests. You have to understand the spirit of the times. The federal government was up to its ass in criminality and a giant scam that killed a lot of people in Vietnam. And this was when the public protests were getting more and more pervasive and larger. And part of this, there was cannabis use.
That's something that I've talked about, that cannabis was partly responsible for the response opposing the Vietnam War. It does something to people that makes them more,
It encourages critical thinking.
There you go.
It's almost like my first epiphany when I read the book and said, geez, I don't know why it's so illegal. It doesn't make any sense. And it didn't.
So what triggered you to get really involved in the movement to get it mainstream medicine?
Curiosity, and also a sense of justice and appropriate medical practice, because it turns out that cannabis is far less dangerous than most any other medication you can think of, especially when dealing with chronic conditions. Mm-hmm. And that cannabis should be looked upon as a first line of medication, instead of it being something that you try after you give up on all the conventional treatments.
Right. Yeah.
And especially in the area of mental health, because as a psychiatrist, I can attest to the very negative side effects of chronic use of antipsychotics and other specific psychotherapeutic drugs. All drugs. There is no free lunch. There are always effects and side effects.
the antipsychotics have some very serious, dangerous side effects. Some of them do, but marijuana doesn't. Can marijuana treat as well as, let's say, Haldol, for example?
Absolutely. And cannabis could be used to treat a whole spectrum of psychiatric conditions, but because of the ignorance and bias, are not used. I'm presenting a paper at the International Cannabinoid Research Society taking place in Hungary this year of a young man who is suffering from insomnia and was inappropriately medicated with a series of so-called mainstream psychotropics, which caused him to become psychotic, suicidal, and so bad that he had to be hospitalized in locked facilities. He became a connoisseur of the locked facilities in the San Francisco Bay Area until his mother brought him to me as a last resort, and I prescribed Marinol because he had reported that cannabis itself helped him sleep. And so I said, well, why not? And so since he couldn't have the marijuana, I tried the Marinol, which worked very well, much to the consternation of the incompetent judge and social workers that had their clutches on him. This is a pervasive problem in American society of unqualified, ignorant, non-medical people dictating psychotropic prescriptions. You know, I don't know where these judges get the hubris that let them think that they can make these health decisions.
It would seem to me that they're practicing medicine without a license, and they should be hauled up before the law themselves.
Well, you see, that's the problem. Who do you complain to
Yeah.
when you're dealing with the hen house watching fox? You can't really complain. What do you do with Bill Lockyer, that scum that has done a lot to block the implementation of the Compassionate Use Act of 1996? What do you do to these indwelling criminals under color of authority that continue to make the stupid and harmful decisions in prescribing medications?
You educate the public by telling them on TV shows like this, so they vote them out of office and get people in there who will understand what they're supposed to do.
Well, we need to have medical treatment turned over to medical personnel instead of allowing probation officers, judges, and prosecutors dictate what kinds of psychotropics. I'm going to mention this afternoon about a couple cases where a pharmacologic version of Franz Kafka was used to incapacitate a patient to prevent him from mounting a significant defense for his using cannabis.
You know, there was just a study that came out of USC on depression, and it kind of showed that marijuana users, whether they're recreation or medical, suffer from less depression than the general public who doesn't use marijuana. It almost sounds like marijuana is something you should, like calcium. It's something that you could almost use as a benefit, as something beneficial.
Well, it's not possible to make those kinds of wide generalizations because you run into the same difficulties that the corrupt pharmaceutical industry does with their shameless hawking of dangerous drugs, saying things that like it should be put in their drinking water. It's so benign and useful in preventing heart attacks. But to put any drug in that kind of position or make those kinds of statements is irresponsible and potentially very hurtful for people who do not react well to these medications, including marijuana.
Right. That was a very tactful way of telling me I'm way off base. Thank you. No, that's good because I I can go on overboard sometimes. I feel it's beneficial that when I see these studies about depression and people who use it are less likely to be depressed. What about the study that Dr. Tashkin did, which showed that on lung cancer, people who...
Well, let me say this about that. It showed that Dr. Tashkin suffers from integrity, that after devoting a well-paid career to finding negative pulmonary effects of cannabis, he finally concluded that there were none.
Yeah.
And that takes cojones and integrity to make that kind of judgment.
Right. And the study said that people who smoke marijuana and only marijuana have a lower incidence of lung cancer than people who don't smoke anything, and indicating there might be a protective effect. It needs more study, but he indicates there could be a protective effect.
I believe so, because cannabis shows protective properties in other areas. I believe it should be like, for example, the first-line treatment for head injuries and strokes. I believe that a lot of nerve and brain damage could be prevented by timely application of cannabis, primarily in the inhaled vaporized form.
So, no doubt, you think one of the worst things that ever happened is when this country outlawed cannabis back in the 30s.
Well, the only group to oppose cannabis being taken off the market was the American Medical Association, when they had some political clout, and they predicted that someday cannabis may be found to be useful, and for that reason they should not take it off the market. And this has really come true in spades.
Well, Doctor, thank you very much for joining us on
pleasure.
Marijuana, Compassion, and Common Sense. And one last thing: how this conference you're at? What do you think about what's been going on here?
Well, it's good to see the Patients Out of Time meeting here in California, because this is perhaps their largest attendance ever, and it shows how the medical cannabis movement has burgeoned and grown virtually exponentially here in California. I believe that the time is rapidly approaching when we're going to have a legitimate and legal access, and hopefully to safe cannabis, because I believe that all cannabis should never be represented as being safe unless it is tested for being free from pesticide residues or other contaminants, because we have to be regulating ourselves in order to prevent the government from making excessive and harmful regulations.
Well, thank you once again for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you around the conference.
My pleasure.